All right, we are now in Module 2. Let's review Module 2's training objectives. In this module, we will introduce key terms, discuss the right of residents to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment, discuss the right of residents and employees to be free from retaliation for reporting sexual abuse and sexual harassment, and also provide information on relevant statutes and the applicable age of consent. So let's explore some of the key terms. Some of them we have already reviewed in Module 1. So let's get started. Sexual abuse by residents. This includes any following acts, such as if the victim does not consent, is coerced in such acts by overt or implied threats of violence, or is unable to consent or refuses. Again, the contact is between the penis and the vulva, or the penis and the anus, including penetration, however slight. Sexual abuse by staff. Very similar in the definition we just saw with the definition of sexual abuse by resident. However, sexual abuse by staff includes DJS employees, employees who are contracted providers, as well as volunteers. Also, we learned that voyeurism would also fall under the definition of sexual abuse. Sexual harassment. The key word here in sexual harassment is that it includes repeated and unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors or verbal comments, gestures or actions of derogatory or offensive sexual nature by one inmate, detainee, or resident directed to another. And the definition of sexual harassment includes the same definition above, but in regards to if a DJS employee, staff member, contracted employee, volunteer engaged in the same behaviors. Let's take a look at reporting. Reporting occurs when someone reports an incident or suspected incident of sexual abuse. Let's take a look at retaliation. This is a term we're really going to dive into in Module 2. Retaliation occurs when a staff or a resident reporter is either harmed or threatened with harm as a result of making a report. And finally, referring back to Module 1, organizational culture. Again, culture is an organization's shared assumption, values, beliefs, attitudes, norms, and practices. Essentially, culture is what you do when no one else is looking. Now I have an activity for you guys. We have some scenarios. What is it? So sometimes it's easy to determine whether an action constitutes as sexual abuse or sexual harassment, but sometimes it's not so simple. So we're going to look at 3 scenarios and determine if they are considered sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or neither. Let's look at scenario 1. So during an activity, a male resident reaches out and intentionally touches a female resident on her buttocks. Based on the description provided, would you say that it's sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or neither? The answer would be sexual abuse. The key word in this scenario is that the male intentionally touched the female on her buttocks. Let's look at scenario 2. A female staff member is conducting cell checks at a male dorm. She looks into one cell where a youth is completely unclothed. She quickly moves to the next cell. Would this be sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or neither? The answer would be neither. The female staff member is conducting her official job duties. She did not linger. She moved forward and continued her job duties. All right, let's look at the final scenario. A male resident makes a sexually suggestive statement to a female resident. Staff corrects him and he apologizes and stops making the comments. What do you think this one is? The answer would be neither. Referring back to the definition of sexual harassment, I mentioned the key term is repeated. In this situation, we can see that after the staff member corrects him, the youth stops making the comments. Just to reiterate, our youth have a right to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment. PREA Standard 115.311 requires that all agencies shall have a written policy mandating zero tolerance towards any forms of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The Department of Juvenile Services has a policy in place. It is the elimination and reporting of sexual abuse and harassment. Again, just to review, Sexual harassment includes repeated and unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or verbal comments, gestures, or actions of derogatory or offensive sexual nature by one resident directed towards another. And it includes repeated verbal comments or gestures of a sexual nature to a resident by a DJS employee, employees of a contracted program provider, or volunteer. This includes demeaning references to gender, sexually suggestive or derogatory comments about body or clothing, or obscene language or gestures. It is always important to understand that any youth in our confined settings, in our care, will always be deemed not able to consent in any situations regarding sexual activity. Also, as a reminder, sexual abuse occurs when the victim is not able to consent to contact, the victim is coerced into sexual contact by overt or implied threats of violence, or the victim is unable to consent or refuse. While the definition of sexual abuse entails physical penetration, intentional touching, and voyeurism in a situation of staff on youth abuse, it does exclude contact incidental to a physical altercation. Again, sexual abuse regarding a staff member, contractor, or volunteer on a resident occurs when there is actual attempt, threatened, or requested contact between the penis and the vulva or the penis and the anus, including penetration, however slight. Contact between the mouth and the penis, vulva, or anus. Contact between the mouth and any body part where the DJS employee of a contracted program provider, or volunteer has the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire. Penetration of the anal or genital opening, however slight, by a hand, finger, object, or other instrument that is unrelated to official job duties, or where the staff member, contractor, or volunteer has the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire. Any other intentional contact, either directly through the clothing or with the genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or the buttocks that is unrelated to official job duties, or where the staff member, contractor, or volunteer has the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire. Any display by a DJS employee of a contracted program provider, or volunteer of his or her uncovered genitalia, buttocks, or breasts in the presence of a resident. Also, voyeurism committed by a DJS employee, an employee of a contracted program provider, or a volunteer would be deemed sexual abuse. Just to review in regards to non-consensual sexual activity. According to the Elimination and Report of Sexual Abuse Harassment, non-consensual sexual activity is any sexual activity between our youth or between youth and staff in a DJS facility, and it is always deemed to be not consensual due to the youth's age and custody status. It is important to understand youth in our care cannot consent to sexual activity due to their youth's age and custody status. Even if a kid is in our care and is of the age of 18 or older, due to the youth's custody status, they are not able to consent to sexual activity. Let's take a look at the next section, reporting. In this section, we'll discuss when a youth comes into our facilities. We will look at the intake process and what information should be disseminated to our youth regarding PREA and our zero tolerance policy. So let's look at youth orientation. All youth upon admission to a DJS detention and or committed facility shall receive as a part of their facility orientation information about the department's policies and procedures to eliminate and report sexual abuse and assault. As a part of a youth's admission process into a facility, staff shall distribute to all youth an information pamphlet titled "What You Should Know About Sexual Abuse or Harassment." This can be found in the policy Elimination and Reporting of Sexual Abuse and Harassment, that's number RF-01-09, and that is also found in Appendix 3 of that policy. This pamphlet addresses the prohibition of sexual contact, how residents can protect themselves from becoming victims. It also discusses counseling and treatment options that are provided to victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault, and the methods to report incidents of sexual abuse and sexual assault. The facility intake process shall be conducted individually with each youth so that youth are provided the opportunity to ask questions in private about the DJS zero tolerance policy for sexual abuse, assault, and misconduct. Also, as a part of a youth's orientation into a facility, staff shall report and discuss the youth handbook, which includes an explanation of the prohibition against sexual misconduct and assault, the multiple procedures available to youth to report any allegations related to sexual misconduct and assault, and that it is in a language that is easily understood by a particular youth. Also, youth should meet with clinical staff. This includes medical and behavioral health. Staff shall discuss individually with each youth the information regarding the prohibition and reporting of sexual misconduct and assault with the youth as a part of their orientation to clinical services within the facility. It is important for staff to understand that with regards to reporting sexual abuse, residents may disclose sexual abuse and harassment to other residents, family members, direct care staff, child advocates, medical staff, behavioral health, teachers, supervisors, facility administrators, case managers, and volunteers. With regards to reporting, it is important that all staff follow the policies and procedures outlined in the incident reporting and reporting of child abuse policies and procedures. Contact DSS of any knowledge, suspicion, or information they receive regarding an incident of sexual abuse or sexual harassment that occurred in a facility. A report shall be made whether or not it is a part of DJS. Also, facility administrators, program directors, regional directors must ensure that all allegations are reported to the above-mentioned authorities. PREA Standard 115.351 requires agencies to have multiple internal ways for residents to privately report. Also, PREA requires that sexual abuse, sexual harassment, retaliation by other residents or staff for reporting sexual abuse and harassment, and staff neglect or violations of responsibilities that may contribute to such incidents should also be reported. Staff must accept and promptly document reports that are made. They can receive reports verbally, in writing, anonymously, from third parties. When an agency learns that a resident is subject to a substantial risk of imminent sexual abuse, it shall take immediate action to protect the resident. So, who must report? Residents, staff, volunteers, contracted program providers, anyone who's witnessed or suspects sexual abuse should report. According to PREA standards, multiple reporting mechanisms should be in place for youth to report any allegations of sexual abuse. Take a moment and think. Does your facility provide multiple ways for residents and staff to report sexual abuse? What are some of those ways? Take a moment and list a few examples. According to PREA Standard 115.361, this standard requires all staff to immediately report any knowledge, suspicion, or information regarding an incident, retaliations against residents or staff who reported an incident, to report any staff neglect or violation of responsibilities that may have contributed to an incident or retaliation. Also, any notification to parents or legal guardians, caseworkers, juvenile attorneys, facility investigators, etc. regarding a PREA matter. Regarding outside entity reporting, the PREA standard also requires that an agency provide residents at least one way to report to a public or private entity or office that is not a part of the agency and that is able to receive and immediately forward resident reports of sexual abuse and harassment to agency officials. The agency should allow the resident to remain anonymous upon request. The standard requires staff to accept reports that are made verbally or in writing, anonymous reports, and reports from third parties. Staff are also required to document any verbal reports received. The agency also has to provide a method for staff to privately report sexual abuse and sexual harassment of residents. In addition to establishing a method to receive third-party reports of sexual abuse and harassment, the agency shall distribute publicly information on how to report sexual abuse and sexual harassment on behalf of the youth. If a staff member is approached by someone other than the alleged victim with a report regarding sexual abuse or sexual harassment, It is important that the staff tells that person any relevant agency policy information. What may happen with the information that they have disclosed, what their involvement with the investigation may be, and whether they will be informed of the outcome of the investigation. Let the person making the report know that the information they have given will be passed up your chain of command in a set time frame as defined by our agency's policy. Let the reporter also know that an investigator may need to conduct an interview. It is important to establish a reporting culture. A code of silence is dangerous in a corrections agency. So what is a code of silence? By definition, an informal institutional or organizational culture that says members of a particular group will not inform on or give evidence or testimony against other members of the group. This occurs even though actions of the other members may involve breaches of policy or even the criminal law. Code of silence is also referred to as the Code of Blue. So let's take a moment and reflect upon some questions. Is reporting a part of your agency's culture? Why would staff witness or suspect misconduct and not report it? Here are a few reasons listed below. I would be ostracized. Staff members who commit misconduct will be fired. I would be fired. I'd be blackballed. Administration wouldn't do anything. Were those some of your answers that you came up with? So after reflecting on those questions and some of the statements, take a look at some of these other questions. How does the Code of Silence impact reporting? What has happened to those who have reported misconduct in your agency? What happens to those who do not report and should have? Would staff feel comfortable reporting? And at what stage do staff report? It is important in our agency that we work individually and collectively to create a reporting culture. By doing so, staff and residents are unafraid of reporting suspected abuse and harassment. Staff and residents have a high degree of trust in the investigative process and in administrative follow-up. Communications and interactions would be generally respectful and professional, both between staff and from staff to residents. So now let's talk about retaliation. According to PREA Standard 115.367, all agencies must have a policy protecting staff and residents from retaliation. Agencies must have multiple ways to protect residents and staff from retaliation, and agencies must also monitor retaliation for at least 90 days following a report of sexual abuse for both staff and residents, and conduct periodic status checks for residents. It is important to know that DJS protects all youth and staff who report sexual abuse or harassment from retaliation. Retaliation is prohibited against anyone who reports alleged sexual abuse or harassment. Youth may be disciplined by the behavioral management system, that is our challenge program, and counseled. If engaging in retaliation, staff may be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. PREA standard requires a safety plan be developed by staff for all victims, perpetrators, and witnesses to prevent retaliation. Such safety plan would be completed by our behavioral health staff. Retaliation would be monitored for 90 days by the facility administrator and the Office of the Inspector General. And monitoring could include, but not limited to, the following: any youth disciplinary reports, housing or program changes, negative performance reviews or reassignments, and monitoring could go beyond the 90 days if the need was necessary. So when does retaliation occur? Retaliation occurs when a resident or staff injures, harms, or intimidates a person who has reported sexual abuse and assault, or attempts to do so in response to the report. Retaliation comes in various forms. Some overt ways of retaliation include slashing car tires, verbal or emotional abuse, physical assault. Some indirect retaliation are veiled threats, shunning from a group, sudden change of demeanor without any explanation. The impact of retaliation on reporting contributes to the Code of Silence. It creates barriers to reporting through threats and intimidation. When people perceive that their safety is at risk, they are less likely to report. So let's talk about false allegations. It is important for employees and staff to understand that any staff member who intentionally makes a false allegation is subject to discipline. Any youth who intentionally makes a false allegation must be counseled, and their conduct needs to be addressed under the DJS Behavioral Management System. And again, that is the challenge program. DJS investigative staff must prove that a false allegation made intentionally by youth and staff was an allegation by that youth and staff and was made false at the time it was made. False allegations are against the law, and youth and staff who make false allegations can be referred by this agency to the Maryland State Attorney's Office to determine criminal prosecution. The agency must also, based on PREA standards, provide emotional supportive services for residents and staff that fear retaliation. According to the DJS PREA policy, a safety plan will be developed by staff for victims, perpetrators, and witnesses to prevent retaliation. And again, those safety plans will be developed with our behavioral health unit. PREA Standard 115.333 requires that all agencies provide education to residents during the intake process on how to report sexual abuse or sexual harassment. This also includes reports of retaliation. We have now completed Module 2. Upon completion, ask yourself these questions. Can you recognize the key terms introduced in this unit? Do you understand the rights of residents to be free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment? And do you understand the rights of residents and staff to be free from retaliation for reporting sexual abuse and sexual harassment? The next few slides will review the PREA standards discussed in Module 2. After reviewing the PREA standards, you are ready to take your second exam for Module 2.